once you apply nitrogen fertiliser or slurry and nitrogen fertiliser combined, the crop will usually use around 2 units of nitrogen per day. The difficulty is when you drop your units by 20 units per acre, once a crop becomes mature, and particularly ryegrass, once it becomes mature, if it's deficient in nitrogen after 40 or 50 days, what actually happens when the grass runs out of nitrogen, it has the seed, it starts reproducing, so it'll head the seed.
Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and on this week's episode, I'm joined by Teagasc advisor Gerard Cregg to discuss top tips for closing silage ground, fertiliser rates and making quality silage. Jerry, you're very welcome. March was a very difficult month with regard to grazing silage ground.
I suppose with the prolonged wet period there and ground, a lot of people have struggled to graze it off, and of course the difficulty with not getting that silage ground grazed off, if it's an old bush of grass left on the silage swards, you're going to end up with bringing that in bales or on the pit, and it's going to reduce your digestibility by anything from 3 to 5 units of digestibility. So it's certainly important to graze it off if at all possible.
Jerry, farmers will be starting to close up silage ground in the coming weeks. What are the main things that they need to consider?
Okay, so I suppose the first thing, Catherine, is to ensure that you have enough silage for next winter. So in terms of having a plan and setting targets for yourself in terms of the amount of ground you have to cut, based again on the calculations in terms of what a suckler cow eats and a whaling in our store, obviously you need to put a plan in place for that, do your calculations. There's plenty of silage left in yards at present. So obviously that's a big saving if you don't have to cut extra ground, or you can reduce the area that you're going to cut. So decide first of all on the amount of cattle you're going to have for the winter, then decide the area that you need to cut. Obviously first cut silage you're cutting in the order of 10 tonne to the acre and probably 6 to 7 tonne for a second cut, and just do your calculations on that. And I suppose the other very important point, given the price of meal at the moment, is that it's important that you make as good a quality silage as you possibly can. With suckler cows, obviously spring calving or dry cows, you're really talking about 65, 68 DMD silage, so you can afford to let it into June maybe, and grass can head out a bit for that type of silage. But for cows that suckling calves over the winter months or certainly into the spring, you need a higher digestibility silage. So something on the order of 74, 75 DMD silage is needed for those cows. I suppose the weanings in the stores are somewhere maybe back 3 or 4 units from that, and any cattle or anyone that's considering finishing cattle, as they well know, that you need to be making the highest quality silage you can at 75 DMD silage. So I suppose it's based on the 2 cuts and what you need to plan in terms of the quality that you're actually making.
And when it comes to applying the fertiliser in relation to the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium that the crop needs, how much would farmers be looking at applying to grow a good quality crop of silage?
Okay, so traditionally the figures that we were using, and maybe they've come back a little bit in terms of the nitrogen use for first cut silage. So anything in the order of 80 to 100 units of nitrogen per acre is used for first cut. The level will depend on the amount of ryegrass or how much ryegrass in the sward. Obviously ryegrass, where you have a high level of ryegrass, it'll be a lot more efficient in terms of nitrogen use. So traditionally we would have targeted about 100 units of nitrogen on those predominantly ryegrass swards. And then the more old pasture you have, or the older grass that you have, you obviously come back down to the 80 or even 70 in cases in that. And from a P&K point of view then, we generally say about 16 units a crop of silage. First cut silage will require about 16 units per acre of phosphate and up on 100 units of potash. Again, for second cut then you reduce that down, it's around 64 units of nitrogen, and again 10 units of phosphate and something in the order of 60 units of potash is what we recommend.
And obviously fertiliser prices are slowly coming back. What would be the best way to apply that requirement?
Yeah, so looking at it, Catherine, I suppose it's costing in the order of €200 an acre for fertiliser for silage. So we have to be fairly prudent in terms of, especially given the returns on beef, you have to be very prudent in terms of how we actually manage that. The obvious one is slurry and the availability of slurry. So 1,000 gallons of slurry is equivalent to about, it's worth around €50 in terms of nutrients. In 1,000 gallons of slurry, Catherine, there's 9 units of N, 5 units of P, and 32 units of K roughly. in the 1,000 gallons. And again, it's about equivalent to a bag of 0730, which is worth around €50. So if we can put out 2,000 gallons of slurry or 2,500 gallons of slurry, there's in the order of 100 to €125 an acre to be saved there. And then we top dress that then with, protected urea is obviously the best value in terms of nitrogen fertilizer, as distinct from CAN and ordinary urea. So it's a lot more efficient in terms of how it's used. So again, we target a bag and a half of urea generally with that, and that being protected. And also then on the 0730 is probably the best fertilizer in terms of value for money besides. So if you have enough slurry, if you're putting out 2,000 gallons of slurry, you're probably putting the equivalent of 2 bags of 0730 on it. And traditionally round about maybe 2.5 or 3 where indices are low. And a very important point in the whole thing, Catherine, and this is the efficiency of P and K based on the pH, the soil that's there. And obviously we have the new lime campaign coming in, and people are applying for that at the moment. There's obviously a difficulty in applying lime at this time of the year, so close to silage, because you're reducing down your pH for silage, and by putting out lime, you're bringing up your pH. So there is an issue in terms of preservation if you apply it now. But certainly towards the back end of the year, it's fierce important to get apply 2 ton of lime on the silage ground. You want your pH as close to 6.5 as you can. As a result of that, you'll improve the efficiency. So what we've traditionally seen in research over the years is that once you drop below 6, a pH of 6, your phosphate in particular is extremely inefficient to use. So there's an awful lot of tied up inorganically. So you're only getting about a 50% hit in terms of the phosphate fertilizer you're being applied once you go below 6. You're losing 20% efficiency then as well on your potash. So it's extremely important at some stage in the next 2 years to actually correct that pH on your soil, and it'll improve the efficiency in terms of the fertilizer that you're actually applying.
Most definitely, Jerry. And I suppose farmers might be considering reducing the nitrogen application with regard to the price of fertiliser. What consequences will that have?
It is a very important point, Catherine, and particularly on better land. So what will happen is that, when you apply nitrogen fertilizer or slurry and nitrogen fertilizer combined, the crop will usually use around 2 units of nitrogen per day. The difficulty is when you drop down to, drop your units by 20 units per acre. Obviously, then, once a crop becomes mature, and particularly ryegrass, once it becomes mature, if it's deficient in nitrogen at we'd say after 40 or 50 days, like, so if you're using the calculation roughly at around 40 days, and we normally leave it to 5-6 weeks to cut, you're talking about 6 or 7 weeks before you cut your silage. What actually happens when the grass runs out of nitrogen, it heads the seed, it starts reproducing, so it'll head the seed. And within a week, you'll lose around 5 units of digestibility when it heads out. And this is particularly important in sort of late May when weather is dry. And if you have a particularly dry spell and growth is good, well then within a matter of days, you'll see a crop going from a leafy vegetative stage to heading out. And very quickly you can reduce your quality dramatically for your winter feed. The other thing I'd like to say on that, Catherine, too, is maybe something that we're looking at here in this part of the world is, and obviously a lot of the dairy farms are looking at the use of red clover. And if you look at it, Catherine, in terms of the price of what you can save in terms of nitrogen fertilizer, if we could target maybe putting in red clover silage, which has no nitrogen requirement at all, and you can take 4 cuts off it, there's about 160 units there's about 160 euros per acre being saved in nitrogen fertilizer. Now, I know there's a cost in establishing that, but it's certainly with climate change and price of inputs, and particular fertilizer, if we could start growing crops with red clover silage that doesn't require nitrogen, there's a huge saving there. And obviously, from trial work in Grange, the quality of that silage is in the order of, it's feeding better than top quality 75 DMD silage with a higher protein level. And in trials there, they're getting a kilo a day weight gain on the calf to beef system there without any meal input. So it's certainly worth looking at, Catherine, in terms of saving down the road. And again, just to bear in mind that it's maybe 3 to 5 year rotation, but there's a big production to be got off it in a short period of time. And given where fertiliser prices is, in particular nitrogen fertiliser prices is, it's a huge saving.
And there's definitely a role in regard to the type of stock that you're finishing, as you mentioned, really.
Yeah, so obviously if your system is heavily dependent on beef finishing or getting high performance, high weight gain on younger cattle, and particularly that calf to beef system where you're heavily dependent on meal inputs, well then certainly that's an area that you should be targeting, is to get as much of that red clover silage into your silage ground as possible. Given that you're, normally in a 2-cut system, you might be taking anything in the order of 18 bales per acre. In a red clover silage situation where you're cutting it 4 times, you can get anything from 24 to 26 bales. So you need less area for it, and you're getting a higher return for it with less nitrogen input in it. Obviously, there's a high demand for potash in it, growing that amount of silage, but it really is worth considering. Again, you couldn't consider putting in red clover silage unless your pH is up around 6.5 at least, and heading for 6.8.
Gerry, what are the expected costs for farmers this year when they're making bales?
You're talking in the order of €32 a bale to €43 a bale, depending on whether you have slurry. So obviously, with slurry, your fertiliser cost is reduced, but your contractor costs are in the order of €20. And then you have your fertiliser costs roughly 32 on top of that, or €12 on top of that. So that's bringing you to €32 an acre. With slurry, and if you haven't the slurry, your fertiliser cost is going up to nearly €20 plus the €20 for the mowing, baling, and wrapping and the gathering after, including the plastic. So, at 10 bales a acre, 400, anything between 320 and 400 tonne an acre is extremely expensive.
In relation to weed control, what impact, for example, can docks have on the crop of silage?
I suppose from a weed control point of view, a lot of issues in relation to docks in silage ground. You can have anything from a 10 or 20% reduction in yield with silage, where there's a heavy burden of docks infestation on the silage ground. And that's certainly something that, particularly from the month of April, when docks are growing at a higher rate than maybe grass initially, you can hit those docks at the rosette stage, and that's certainly worth considering and treating. Again, not only are you losing in terms of yield, but you're also losing in quality. But I do think, Catherine, that it's worth saying that where you have a dock problem, and traditionally you'd see it on silage ground, is that a lot of that problem is caused by compaction as well. So why the dock thrives in that situation is because its root structure and its tap root is able to travel more in the ground, down in the ground, on compacted ground. So we would be recommending, Catherine, that if you have a high dock problem or dock burden infestation, you should be considering subsoiling, particularly after your second cut, if ground is dry. Now, before you subsoil or rip ground, you need to have a prolonged dry period of a month's dry weather. But certainly that should be something that people should consider if the docks are a continuous problem on the farm.
That's great, Gerry. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Catherine.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to Gerry for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.